Hello everybody and welcome to Megalo Tips and Tricks, Photoshop 3, Layers, Text, and Workspace. Today we're going to go over how to create and use layers, how to create and modify text, and how to switch the workspaces to get additional tools that we can use to modify our images. After we've gone over those and used those to get us to a point to where we have this image that's currently on the screen, we'll talk about how we used those tools to get there, and then from there I'll talk about how I went from converting this into a 3-plate etching with some of the traditional print techniques you'll have available to you at Megalo when we all get back in there. So this is what we're going to be working towards, but first things first, I want to get to a new document. So this is where you're gonna start when you are starting to make a new document. As you open it up, you'll have a background layer that's probably white. The first thing I like to do is convert my background layer to a new layer. All I did there is double click on background and it'll type up this. You can change the colors, change the mode that it blends with, the opacity. Really what I like to do is I just double click and I hit OK. What that mainly does is it unlocks the background layer so I can make more changes to it. I always like to have as much freedom to change things as I can, so I never really work with a background layer that's locked. I always convert it to layer 0. Okay, so to make a new layer, you've got a couple different options. One is this sticky note down here at the bottom next to the trash can in the bottom right. If you click on that, it'll give you a new layer. If you're working with a Mac, the hotkey for that is Shift-Command-N. Could be a little bit quicker. I find you can just click the sticky note. Either one works. Okay, so we've got this layer. The other way we can make a layer in Photoshop is if we come up here to File and we go down to Place Linked. This will open up your Finder window, and you can place any image that's on your computer into your Photoshop document. So we'll just hit Perch Reference and Place. Great. So the transform box is already located up here, and so I'd like to transform this. I can rotate the fish, bring them up, drag them out. Remember from last time, if you hold the Shift key, it'll maintain your proportions while you do this. I have something, I want to get to a fairly large fish that goes off the edge. That's a bit too big. Somewhere like that's probably good enough. And then you just hit enter. Great. Now it looks like just that fish is there. However, if I turn off the background layer, we can see this white area will cover anything that's behind layer 1 when we start adding new layers. So let's go ahead and get rid of that white section. You'll see if I drag my mouse over it, I get this no symbol, and that's because this is a smart object currently. If I click on it, you'll see Photoshop says that I have to rasterize it before continuing. So just hit OK, and that'll turn that into a normal layer. Okay, so I want a yellow background, but if I were to just click on layer 0, have my yellow paint bucket and click this, you'll see that white pops up. If I click on this, I have a couple options. I could just click on those with the paint bucket and that would be fine. The problem is if I put anything behind this fish layer, like between layer 0 and perch reference, that layer yellow will now block what I'm trying to show underneath it. So let's step back a couple and we'll get our white back, turn this off, and we'll make a quick selection. So color range is probably easy enough. Say okay. If I were to do this though, you can see I'm going to get some of the belly of the fish and I don't want to lose that. So we're just going to hit cancel. We'll use a different selection tool. Magic wand. That looks pretty good. We can click that, delete, click this one, delete, Command D, and we're good to go. We only have the part of the perch that we want. So now we can turn that on. So already pretty quickly, we're looking pretty good. We do want to flip this. And the only reason I'm flipping is because I know what the final print looks like and I want this to blend in pretty nicely. So all we can go is up to transform, and at this point, flip horizontal is gonna be easy enough. You can see that if we do that though, it flips that and we have to just keep modifying it, which is fine. At this point, you can just magic wand, delete, Command D, and now you can just move this fish around to wherever you need them to be. That looks probably good enough for us. Okay, so there's some layers. I want to go ahead and add a few more layers to get some texture into the background. As you can see from my original, what I'm working towards, I don't have any texture. I did all of the texture of the final print in the etching studio, but let's see what it looks like. It'll also be another way to talk about some of the layer properties. So let's place a couple more images. I've got this iron fence reference. That looks pretty good. Because I just need it to be a texture, I'm just gonna drag this up, make it big. Great. And we'll add maybe one more on top of that. Let's see here. Preferences, place linked. Okay, and let's just add one more of those images. We'll do this. We'll do this one, the vent place. Great. And we'll make that real big again too. Okay, so this looks pretty weird, and you might be asking yourself, all right, Tim, why'd you do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, we can choose the way that these layers blend into each other. So as you can see, we've got normal, dissolve, darken. We got all sorts of different things that we can go and select, and we'll see what Photoshop does. You can drag your layers around, just play around with them. You start getting textures. The other thing that you can do is adjust the opacity of each layer. You can do a little bit, you can do a lot. It's really up to you how you want to play around with these. If you wanted, you put the opacity of this layer down and drag that layer up, and that changes things too. You have a lot of options to play around with your layers, opacity, all these different things. Pretty good. The other way you can go and play with these types of tools, though, is if you were double click on any of them, it will bring up this layer styles menu. So you have all of those same options here that you can change and play with. You have your opacity slider, but then you have other blenders. I've never really used this, so let's just play around with it. Lower some opacity, take off some of the, see what that does. I don't know. Blend if gray, play this around, underlying layer. We'll just leave it at gray, see what that does. There's all sorts of different things, bevel and emboss, strokes, shadows, glows, gradients, all sorts of different things you can play around with in different settings in here. But you can see you have tons of layer style options that you can go and manipulate all these things with. So, okay, cool. That looks good. Good enough. I'm just going to maybe reduce the opacity a little bit more. Maybe let's go play around with this too. And we'll just say, I don't know, do a red one, and try and modify some of these things. Okay, that looks good enough for me. Great. And then we might even reduce the opacity a little bit more. Those look fine. Okay, so that's kind of some of the stuff you can do with your layers and playing around. You could do that with this perch if you wanted as well, changing things around. I'm not going to, but you could. Next part of this process is the text tool. Text tools are pretty easy to use, pretty straightforward, but you do have two options. One, if you click and drag, it will give you a text box. And let's change our text color to black just so we can see what we're doing. It'll give you a text box, and you can type whatever you want and it'll fit to the box. If you were to select everything, you can change if it's left, centered, or right. You can change the color up at the top here. You can change the type of the text. You can change the font size. You could also change italic, bold, and you have all of your different text options up here. Sometimes they can take a little bit of time to load because Photoshop does have quite a few, but you can pick all sorts of different texts that you can use. Okay, so let's get rid of that one. The other option you have for text is rather than dragging a box, you can just click once and it will just start typing wherever you have it. So I have this bait and tackle. Great. So I can just now move that around with my move tool. That's what I have, bait and tackle. Now, if you want to change your text, grab on the text tool again and just click your text. Command A will select everything. I actually want this in all caps. So I'm going to say bait and tackle. So let's go change the text. I believe what I used was impact. That's usually the text I like. So at this point, we've got, a lot of things in here that we can do. Okay. Another way is that you can change this. If you double click on this, you get your layer styles, and this will come in handy in a second. But if you click on your text layer, if you go to type, you can then hit this rasterized type layer. That lets us do the transform command. So from here, if you didn't want to go around and play with all of your font size and spacing and everything, you can just leave it as is, turn it into an image layer rather than a text layer, and then you can modify it just like we did with our fish. You can stretch it, flip it, all sorts of weird stuff. So that's one way we could get our T, ampersand, and T. What you'll notice, though, is that if we do this and we make this really big, we're going to start to get a pixelated line, which smooths out a little bit, probably because of the way I've got my resolution set on this file, but it can make it pixelated if you scale this up too big. So we might go to that, but if we step back further, so now we have a text layer again, another thing you can do is change your workspace. So right now, there's a few options up here, 3D, that's cool. I can bend my text around, in an arc if I wanted to do that or something like that. But there's not a whole lot of tools here. So what we can do instead, if we click off of our text layer really quick, we can go up here to this middle icon in the top right. We'll click on that, and we'll change this workspace from Essentials, which is the workspace we've been working in, into Graphic and Web. That'll give us all of our text tools. Now, usually if you're going to do any sort of heavy typesetting, you'd rather work in a program like InDesign or maybe Illustrator rather than Photoshop. But since I'm using this text mainly for a digital sketch rather than a finished product, it's going to be fine just in Photoshop with what we're doing. You can play with any of these that you want. 3D will have tools for 3D work, and painting and photography. They all have just kind of presets made to make the work in that style a little bit easier. You could also create a new workspace. I've never needed to do it, but if you wanted to play around with something to have all the tools you use all the time in one spot, you can create your own workspace coming up into here. So from this point, if I take my text tool again, and I highlight this, I can change how big my height is. I can go and change the font size, the type, I can change if I had, if I had these on top of each other, I can space them out differently, either on top of each other, or if I wanted to really space them out. You can see I've added quite a bit of space into these. Let's step back a couple. All right, we'll get back to here. From here, if we highlight our text, we could also change italics. This would be all caps. This would have your lowercase letters turn into small capitals. We can put a subscript or a superscript. We can underline things. We can strike through. We do all sorts of different stuff to our text in this window. So you can play around with a lot of different things here. Here, I believe this will change the spacing of our type. This will change how wide it gets, spacing in between letters. So there's all sorts of different things that you can play with in the workspaces. Okay, so to get where we want to go, I'm going to kind of undo a lot of that. That looks good for me. And I find that for what I'm after, if I just take this and I rasterize the type layer, that's going to get me to where I want to go quickest and for what I need. So let's just drag this out and we'll get what we want into here. Still not big enough. Now you might be wondering, Tim, why'd you write the whole word? Part of that is because when I was making this print, I wanted to be able to play around with what part of the letters I wanted to see, and it just turned out that that was what I was happy with. So that's why I have the whole letters there. Really, I could have just typed capital T space ampersand space capital T, and that would have worked just fine. Okay, so again, this is what we're aiming for. So let's go ahead here, move that over a little bit more. Let's go ahead here and change that color. I want this red. One of the things, if you want a particular color, you can click, you'll get a little eyedropper, and you can just click whatever color you want to find, and Photoshop will match those colors perfectly. So now that I got my red, I'm going to change back to the Essentials workspace, and I'm just going to color in these letters red. Okay, now how do I get this black outline on my layers that I'm after? Well, one of the ways I can do that is draw a black outline, but that would be actually quite hard because I'm using a mouse. Or I can double click the layer, get this layer style, and now I can go to the stroke. So if I do stroke, you can see it put a stroke on the outside of my layer. I can adjust that to varying thicknesses using the size. I can change the position, so inside will go to the inside of the letter, outside, of course, is the outside of the letter, and center will split the difference of those two lines. I believe we'll just use outside, that'll be good. You can also change the opacity of that if you want to, and the color, which I want to be black. Okay, and okay. Now you can see how jagged this is compared to this one. I guess what I probably did in this was set the size a little bit better with my size of my font rather than just the type modification. But you can see either way will work. And if you are just using this as a sketch, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so that's a couple things you can do in Photoshop. We're pretty close to where I got. If I were to just take these off, it's going to look almost the same. The spacing's a little bit different on this new one because I didn't line it up perfectly. But okay, so for the most part, we've gotten through all of the tools that we need to get to our digital sketch. Okay, so even though we've gotten to where we want to get for our sketch, I just want to show another kind of thing you can do. If you were to take and select color range and get your letters going, okay, we can do that. What we can do is if we turn this off, we've just got a selection now. So if I go to my vent and I take, I don't know, maybe my eraser tool, I'm going to rasterize that layer and I'm going to get rid of this vent. Okay, cool. If I then went to this one and I rasterized this layer, I still have this. What I want to do now is get rid of this extra texture in here. So what I'm going to do is select inverse. I'm on the perch. I can go to the iron fence. I can get rid of some of that. And I'm just left with, I'm just left with my two different types of textures. Okay, so now that we're here, you can see that you can play around with all sorts of different textures. You can use the select tools to blend those layers together as many ways as you want. Do all sorts of things to them. Go wild. One of the things that you could do if we drag this around, can bring those textures over our letters. We could even bring them over the perch if we wanted. You can play around to your heart's content with this. But all I've really wanted to get to at this point is here. Okay, so once you're here and you've got your finished image on Photoshop, now you can, as I've said before, print this out. This one's small enough that it would have printed out on an A3 paper. So you just print that out, cut it, trace the back with red iron oxide so you turn this into a carbon copy, and you can trace the black layer onto an etching plate. I had an etching plate that already had stuff on it, which is why I was using those textures, because of my plate that I placed this on was textured. So if you trace this onto a new etching plate, and you'd have something that looked like this in my case, where I had all these sorts of different textures on this old beat up etching plate. Once I traced it on, the red that you're seeing here is sugar lift. So you can paint your sugar lift onto the plate, and you can do all of your outlines from here. At this point, you can use your liquid bitumen, place it on, put it in hot water, and you'll pull off your sugar lift. If you placed an aquatint on that, all of these lines will print black. Your textures will also do that as well. You can then transfer that onto support plates. And so that, because you have this as your reference, you know on which support plate, because both of your support plates will have black on them, you can look at this and you can say, oh, I know where it needs to be yellow. I know, so you can block out the black, you can block out the red, and you can just leave the yellow. And then you can do that with another one saying like, oh, I know where red's going to be. And then in areas like this, you can say, well, that's going to be different aquatint layers of yellow, but there's going to be a little bit of black aquatinting mixing with it. Here, there's going to be some red aquatinting mixing with the yellow to give this orange. And eventually, once you build up those layers, you'll end up with something, in theory, that goes from that digital sketch all the way through your etching plates to something that should look like this. I hope you enjoyed the video and that it gives you plenty of ideas on how you can play around with Photoshop and how you can maybe use some of the tools and explore and do things that I haven't gone over, and figure out your own process so that you can come up with plenty of ideas to keep creative and be inspired for when we can all get back into Megalo. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week.